Thank you so much and welcome. I will give the word initially to Professor Dr. Monique Schier, who is the Vice President for International Affairs and, dare we say it, Diversity at the University of Tübingen. Dr. Monique.
Dear Professor Madigan, dear Professor Dimiri, dear colleagues, esteemed guests, it is a great privilege to welcome you today to the opening public session of the 23rd meeting of the Building Bridges Seminar, the 23rd meeting of the Building Bridges Seminar. President Pullman would have loved to welcome you herself on this special occasion, but unfortunately she was unable to attend and sends her warmest regards and best wishes. This seminar, which was founded over 20 years ago, has become a hallmark of dialogue and understanding at the intersection of Muslim and Christian thought. Since 2002, Building Bridges has developed into a truly international community that has brought scholars from across the globe together who connect with each other in theological conversation. Indeed, the name has kept its promise and has built bridges. As you may know, universities in Germany have played a leading role in advancing Muslim-Christian theological engagement in recent years. The University of Tübingen maintains close ties with colleagues at the universities of Paderborn, Bonn, Frankfurt, and the Humboldt University in Berlin, which generously hosted Building Bridges last year. All these universities have been instrumental. The commitment seen in Germany to establishing academic institutions for Islamic theology alongside historic Protestant and Catholic faculties has proven exceptionally fruitful, as it has at the University of Tübingen with the establishment of the Center for Islamic Theology. This policy and the innovative theological approaches it has inspired deserve wider recognition beyond these walls. This year's theme, which is belonging, addresses a concept that is highly relevant not only within theological and religious contexts, but also in broader social and academic discussions. A collaborative examination of how the notion of belonging is shaped and understood in diverse traditions, cultures, and societies is extremely meaningful. At times, the concept fosters inclusion. At other times, it marks boundaries and fosters exclusion. In the spirit of academic inquiry, this seminar offers a valuable platform for critical reflection and interdisciplinary exchange, encouraging mutual understanding and fresh perspectives on very important questions in interreligious dialogue. As a university committed to excellence in research, we value interreligious discourse as we continuously strive to build on our established strengths. The guiding concept of the university, which you may have heard, is research, relevance, responsibility. Also embraces the principles open to new challenges and a global scope of action. And these slogans and mottos reflect our commitment not only to continuing on our proven path, but also to setting new strategic priorities within an international research landscape. One of our most important principles is to foster a culture of commitment and cooperation, much like the Building Bridges Seminar is doing. This principle is important to maintain as a leading center of research with international visibility. It is no exaggeration to say that for over 2 decades, the Building Bridges Seminar has brought together an unparalleled group of internationally recognized Christian and Muslim scholars for sustained, intensive study and exploration of the most pressing issues at the interface between Islam and Christianity. At its core, Building Bridges is an exercise in relational theology, an ongoing commitment not only to learning about one another's traditions, but to learning from one another in a spirit of mutual respect and trust. This important work would not be possible without the invaluable partnership and support of numerous institutions and individuals. In particular, though, we extend our heartfelt thanks to the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University, whose continuing support has been essential. And I am especially grateful to Professor Demiri and the entire team at the Center for Islamic Theology, whose vision and dedication have made this gathering possible. My heartfelt thanks also go to Professor Daniel Madigan, whose outstanding leadership as chair of the Building Bridges Seminar continues to inspire us all. Thank you both for being here and making this exceptional seminar possible. So, and now it's my pleasure to give the floor to Professor Laila Demiri, who will offer a few words of welcome herself. Thank you very much.
So, dear guests, dear friends, dear colleagues, I'm delighted to welcome you all to the opening of the 23rd Building Bridges Seminar. It is a true honor for us to have the opportunity of hosting this remarkable event, one of the longest running and most serious recurrent intellectual engagements between Muslims and Christians today. And for me personally, it is of particular significance, since it was in 2005, exactly 20 years ago, in Sarajevo, that I had the pleasure to attend a Building Bridges seminar for the first time. As a graduate student, then working on my PhD at the University of Cambridge, it was a unique learning opportunity for me to have joined a circle of such prestigious scholars and practitioners, among them the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, my former supervisor from Rome, Dan Madigan, and my new supervisor from Cambridge, Tim Winter. As a graduate student, one felt like a mouse among the giants. It did not require much effort to notice and sense not only the superb quality of theological discussions held, but also the exceptionally natural environment Building Bridges creates for meaningful dialogue and interfaith learning. The theme of belonging aptly suits this year's location, where the seminar will take place in the next 5 days, the new building of the Center for Islamic Theology, formally opened earlier this year, which gives us a strong awareness that we belong to this historic university, originally founded in 1477. Our center, created to extend the German settlement tradition of including faculties of Protestant and Catholic theology in major universities to reflect the new multi-religious nature of German society, evidently places interreligious scholarship at the heart of its programs and agenda. In our campus of theologies, we work closely with the Protestant and Catholic faculties in a network of mutual support as we navigate the complex question of maintaining academic excellence while nurturing students who will contribute to the spiritual well-being of their communities and also to the vital process of social cohesion. This is more important today than ever as new political formations are evolving, which challenge the multi-religious and multicultural reality of modern Germany and Europe more widely. So our belongingness here in Tübingen operates at 2 levels. Firstly, as Muslims belonging to European society and culture. This requires a close attention to Islam's nature as Abrahamic, and to historic engagements and influences between the 3 monotheisms, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And secondly, Islamic theology as it belongs to Western academia, to existing Enlightenment debates about the nature and function of theology in a university. An additional layer of interest and debate is supplied by the arrival of Muslim thinkers, who do not just study the past in the Oriental studies mode, but receive it in order creatively to reshape a Muslim present and future. So the presence of Building Bridges here feels entirely right. And the program looks amazing, no less than 5 days of feasting for our hearts and minds as we continue a millennial discussion which began with the first Quranic appraisals of the people of the book so long ago. We are particularly grateful to Dan Madigan, David Marshall, and Sam Wagner for giving us the opportunity to serve as the host this year. Thanks go to the Georgetown University for their wonderfully generous support of the event. We also express our gratitude to the University of Tübingen for contributions from the Unibund and the Center for Religion, Culture and Society, co-chaired by our Vice President, Professor Monique Scheer. Last but not least, a big thank you to Lea Schlenker and her wonderful team for all the organizational work here in Tübingen. A very warm welcome to you all, and especially to our international guests who have traveled considerable distances to join us on this special occasion. I wish you a blessed and fruitful 5 days here in our university. So welcome to Tübingen.
Thank you, Leila. Thank you, Monique, for this welcome. I'm slated to speak for 10 minutes about the Building Bridges seminar, but you've heard all about the Building Bridges seminar already from Leila and from Professor Scheer. And you heard from me, most of you, those of you who are part of the seminar, you heard from me already at lunch. So I just, before I introduce our two keynote speakers, I would just like to highlight a couple of points that have not been fully made yet. From my own experience of being in part of this seminar since 2003, I would say that it has the conversation with Muslim sisters and brothers in the study of text, scriptural text together, has shaped my Christian theology. I don't claim to be a Christian theologian, except as an amateur, but there is no doubt that these conversations and what has followed from them have shaped my Christian theology. And that's a remarkable thing in one respect, but quite unremarkable in another. It's remarkable perhaps because Christian theology in many respects has tried to keep its distance from Islamic theology, from Islamic faith. It has tried to push it back, dismiss it. But to be honest as a Christian, one has to recognize that Islam emerges as with a claim to be a reform movement, to be God's reform of the monotheistic tradition, to be God's word correcting what has gone wrong, what has been exaggerated, what the failures have been. And one has two choices as a Christian. You can either say, well, that's wrong, and you block it, or you can take the critique seriously and explore it openly, allow it to the questions that are posed by the Islamic tradition to rework the terrain of one's theology, which is not to say that it becomes a less Christian theology, but it is to say that the value of the Islamic tradition, which comes out in these kinds of conversations, is that it focuses on the very centrally, the unique aspects of the Christian tradition. And so it forces a Christian theologian, amateur though he or she might be, to really look more carefully at these central affirmations and to find ways of opening up the conversation further, rather than simply finding a way to defend oneself against the critique or to push the critique back and assert power over it and the speakers of it. It is a way of saying, how about we look at it this way? How about I find another way of explaining why it is I believe such and such, why it is that I put it that way. So this, even though the Building Bridges seminar is in some respects a niche, boutique kind of activity in the theological world, to me it is anything but boutique. It is something which ought to be And now we have the opportunity, with the presence of substantial numbers of Muslim scholars in Europe, in the US, in Australia, friends and colleagues of mine all over, we have a unique opportunity to go more deeply into the mysteries of our faith and to continue exploring, because what God has to say to us, what we are called to listen for in our scriptures and in our traditions, is inexhaustible, as the Quran affirms. So I'll leave it at that. I think it's important to recognize that this is not a dead-end activity. This is something that I think, in principle, ought to become a general practice for Christian theologians. Certainly, I leave it up to my Muslim sisters and brothers to decide whether these kind of conversations are helpful and to be generalized for them. So without further ado, we have two speakers who will address somewhat the question of belonging. Leila has already mentioned it, Monique also. Both of them have specialized in a way in the question of belonging to a tradition, belonging to a religious community and what that means. But of course, we will be looking in these days not only at the question of religious belonging, but all the sorts of belonging, political, cultural, intellectual belonging that are part of a fully human life and community. So, first, Professor Catherine Cornell. No, you shout, sorry. Dr. Yusha Patel from Lafayette College in Pennsylvania. You have his CV, as it were, on your programs, so I won't read it out for you because I've already taken enough time. But I recommend his book to you, The Muslim Difference. Yusha.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. First, I wish to thank everyone who expressed with deep gratitude, all of those who made this gathering possible, folks at Georgetown University, folks here at the University of Tübingen, and to thank all of you for spending and lending your expertise and wisdom here to this gathering. I wish to open with a personal anecdote that situates my personal and professional engagement with the elemental but enigmatic concept of belonging. I was born in Europe, in Edinburgh, Scotland, and I would have likely remained there had it not been for an incident that took place at school. One day, I returned home from primary one, the equivalent of kindergarten in the United States, and I told my mother, quote, "I'm in a group all by myself," end quote. I was 5 years old, quiet, but well-behaved. Yet my teacher, Miss McGowan, had chosen to physically set me apart from my classmates during class, sitting me at a desk in a corner alone, while everyone else learned together in groups. I didn't understand why, and neither did my mother, Allah yarhamha. A former teacher, my mother was shocked. School was not only a place to learn, but to socialize, a place where children learn how to conform, respect authority, and belong. The following day, she visited my class and witnessed firsthand how I was being separated from the other children. My mother was not one to back down from a confrontation, despite her small size. She was barely 5 feet tall. I don't know what that is in metric. She told Miss McGowan that isolating a child is psychologically damaging. Quote, "He needs to socialize with his peers, or he will think that something is wrong with him, that he is different." end quote. I was, after all, the only student of color and only Muslim in my class. But Ms. McGowan countered that I was simply too different to be included in group learning. She reasoned that it was in the, quote, best interest of both me and my peers that I learn alone. Hurt and frustrated, my mother took her case to the school administration. But having entered the bowels of the school bureaucracy, she was overpowered by the foul stench of discrimination that polluted the hallways. They too refused to acknowledge what had become obvious to my mother, that Ms. McGowan's teaching methods were discriminatory. The incident was a tipping point for my mother, who had been told to, quote, go back to your own country, end quote, among other racist insults, blatant and subtle, since emigrating from Bombay to Lusaka to Edinburgh with my father in 1973. We may have looked different, but we did not deserve to be treated differently. My mother resolved to move our family to the United States, hoping to find greater equality. We emigrated that same year. Reflecting back on that traumatic moment, I realized that I felt hurt because I was made to feel excluded, made to feel that I do not belong. Most, if not all, children would have felt that way because humans innately have a longing to belong. Our desire and need to belong reminds us that we are social animals, that who we become and who we become is through our relations with other creatures, human and non-human. The subject is especially relevant to our contemporary moment, as nation states within and beyond the global West stem the tide of globalization and more sharply define the borders between us and them, between who belongs and who doesn't. Just last week, the United States presidential administration issued a reinvigorated travel ban, a Muslim ban 2.0, if you will. We are also living in what has been called a loneliness epidemic. Loneliness, the perception of social disconnection, is harmful both to emotional and physical health. In 1943, psychologist Abraham Maslow put belonging at the third stage in his hierarchy of human needs, above physiological and safety needs. But modern scientific research suggests belonging is even more essential. According to one influential study, those who feel lonely are twice as likely to die early than those who do not. Put differently, just as thirst and hunger are signals that one ought to drink and eat, loneliness is a signal that one craves social connection. Establishing relations of belonging can be a source of healing and repair. In what follows, I first provide a brief sketch of what I think belonging means. I then examine some key texts from Islamic scripture and the interpretations of some Muslim thinkers who read them that demonstrate how the concept is configured in the Islamic tradition. How can Islam help us to think about the meaning and value of belonging? And how did the Prophet Muhammad transform belonging into a lived reality for his community? My quasi-descriptive account of Islamic perspectives on belonging, which is intended to be illustrative and not exhaustive, then gives way to a modestly constructive engagement as Muslims continue to imagine their relations with non-Muslims in global modernity. We usually speak of belonging as if we know what it is. We know when we feel it, and we know when we don't. But belonging is a multivalent Anglophone term with multiple layers of meaning. On the one hand, we may think of belonging as category placement, as in, quote, this shoe belongs in the closet, or ownership, as in, quote, this umbrella belongs to me, end quote. But in this talk, I display less concern with these classificatory, more cognitive senses of the term. I focus more on the sense of belonging as the experience of being part of a group, of being in community. Belonging is a warm and fuzzy term that evokes a sense of home, of having a sense of place. For some of you, that might mean where you grew up, or your native country if you immigrated abroad, or another place where you feel you belong, with all its memories, images, scents, people, and things. Places where we belong are safe spaces. We do not feel threatened or fearful. Places where we belong are places of connection, not alienation, solidarity, not division, intimacy, not distance, friendship, not enmity. They are places where we feel welcome, appreciated, accepted, and loved. They are also places where we have agency. We are not mere spectators. We feel like we can make a difference. And it is because belonging speaks to our deeply felt emotions that it means having a sense of place beyond physical location as well. Hence the well-known English phrase, home is where the heart is. In this figurative place, belonging refers to the depth of affection we share with other people. Simply being in the midst of a large crowd does not mean that we belong or feel like we belong. We must feel like we have a place in relation to others. that we are oriented within a network of social relations. Otherwise, we are adrift in a crowd of strangers. Belonging in this figurative sense of place extends to being oriented within time through the notion of tradition. Through authoritative narratives of argumentation and repertoires of embodied practices, traditions situate us in the past and help orient our present and future. Belonging is intimately tied to who we are, our identities, our affiliations across religion, nationality, status and class, ethnicity, race, gender, sexual orientation, and ability. Often multiple markers of identity determine a person's sense of belonging. For example, a Muslim woman's religious affiliation will matter little in a mosque that only permits Muslim men to enter its premises. In these spaces, belonging is shaped not only by religion, but by gender as well. To make sense of belonging in a specific context, we must take account of people's salient markers of identity. Belonging in a specific community may be defined broadly or narrowly, in relation to both vectors of inclusion and exclusion in varying degrees. In the case of Islam, take for example these Quranic verses, quote, "O humankind, indeed we have created you from male and female, and made you peoples and tribes that you may know one another," end quote. According to a bare reading of this verse, God created different peoples in order for them to come together and connect, to build bridges across difference, like we are doing here. The verse has an inclusive spirit. But there are other verses in which these lines of difference solidify into walls that breed division, even hostility. Take this example. "O believers, do not take unbelievers as friends instead of believers," end quote. That's from Quran 4:145. Indeed, how can belonging across religious lines take shape without the possibility of friendship? Belonging compels us to think about boundaries. Where do we draw the line between us and them, native and foreign, friend and enemy? We must thus speak about the ethics and politics of belonging. What are the ethical guideposts that ought to guide how religious communities provide a sense of belonging to insiders and outsiders alike? With this broad conceptual foundation in mind, I now turn to the Sunnah, the embodied praxis of the Prophet Muhammad, which Muslims believe comprises revelation alongside the Quran, in order to illustrate how the Prophet sought to make belonging in the community of believers a lived reality. Even from the hand-picked examples here, a few of which are in the booklet of texts and others that are not, it becomes apparent that the Prophet wanted Muslims to live in community, to feel community. Most of the examples are etiquettes and proprieties known as adab, drawn from the textual archive of the Prophet's Sunnah, that are germane to creating a culture of belonging. To embody faith, as I argue, is to embody belonging. So I numbered these. So number one, spread peace. Despite how Islam and Muslims are often portrayed in the press, the Prophet encouraged his community to be a community of peace. So afshu salam, or spread peace, and you will find peace. In another hadith, he says, the Prophet, "Those nearest to God are those who first initiate greetings of peace." And yet in another, when asked what the best deed in Islam was, he responded, quote, "To offer greetings of peace to friend and stranger alike," end quote. So to offer greetings of peace is not only a communal marker of distinction, it is a sincere, heartfelt prayer for well-being and the removal of anxiety. It creates a space of hospitality and welcome, and it tells people that you've entered a safe space and to be at ease, to let down your guard. While it is true that some hadiths assert that these etiquettes should be observed only between Muslims, many scholars recognize these narrations are specific to interfaith polemics that took place during the Prophet's time, and encourage Muslims to initiate greetings of peace to non-Muslims as well. This makes sense, since to seek the well-being, safety, and security of humankind reflects an attribute of God, as-salam, the source of all peace. And of course, it is also the etymological basis of the religion Muslims call Islam. 2, importance of body language. According to descriptions of the Prophet's everyday behavior, he consistently employed non-verbal cues to make people feel valued. One way he would do this is by rotating his entire body to face his interlocutors, to let them know that he had their full attention. He let a person know before any words were even spoken that he or she his or her concerns had value. 3, give others the benefit of the doubt. The Prophet advised, quote, "Beware of suspicion, of dhann, for it is the greatest lie," akthubul hadith. Here the Prophet is urging believers to have a good opinion of others, to approach others in good faith, to beware of biases and preconceptions that cast others in a negative light, because distrust is like a poison that sows division and conflict. In a climate of mistrust where everyone is suspicious of one another, belonging is simply not possible. 4, treat others as you want to be treated. In the Islamic version of the Golden Rule, the Prophet advises followers, none of you truly believes until he loves for his brother, or sister for that matter, what he loves for himself or herself. Here the Prophet is advising believers to decenter themselves, to oppose egocentrism and selfishness in order to bring others from the margins to the center, to show others respect, dignity, and value by putting them on an equal plane. 5, sharing is caring. The Prophet encouraged believers to be generous and share. Quote, "Tahadu tahabu," exchange gifts, it will increase affection between you. By sharing material objects of value, a community can tighten emotional bonds and create a philanthropic culture of giving. And 6, finally, pray together. The Prophet wanted Muslims to pray together. One way he did this is by quantifying the value of ritual prayer, salat, in congregation. According to a hadith, group prayer has 27 times more value in the eyes of God than prayer performed alone. In another narration, 25 times. Ideally, group prayer takes place 5 times a day, every day, not just Fridays. Through this habit, feelings of communal belonging and solidarity become rooted in faith. Believers feel connected to God and to one another. Taken together, and once again, this is just a kind of a cluster that I've selected, these etiquettes and proprieties illustrate how the Prophet wanted to teach Muslims how to live in community, how to cultivate belonging. It was part of being a good Muslim. For belonging to be experienced, it must be embodied in everyday social practices. Having established with the above examples that belonging is a core value in Islamic scripture, I now narrow my focus to an example or some examples of interfaith belonging in the Islamic tradition. So I begin with some preliminary thoughts on the multivalent label people of scripture, Ahlul Kitab, coined in the Quran. It is I would argue, a pre-modern antecedent to our contemporary notion of Abrahamic faiths. While the latter appeals to a shared genealogy to connect Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the former appeals to a common provenance for divine revelation. While the Quran often employs this term in polemical contexts, as noted above, its conceptual arc nevertheless bends towards inclusivity. Indeed, God portrays the Quran as part of a historical continuum of divine revelation that includes Christians and Jews. Alterity, or otherness, in the Quran cannot be oversimplified as a binary division between believers and unbelievers, but is rather a continuum that ranges from wholehearted surrender, Islam, to hostile denial, kufr, where the people of Scripture, including Muslims, oscillate between these two poles. I will now examine a text that I've worked on for a long, long time, one of the most influential and well-known hadiths in the Islamic scriptural canon. According to a tradition narrated on the authority of the companion Ibn Umar, the Prophet Muhammad said, "Whoever imitates a people becomes one of them. Man tashabbaha biqawmin fahuwa minhum." At face value, this pithy statement appears like a benign observation about group belonging. A person who emulates the behavior of a community or group comes to resemble the members of that group, eventually becoming, quote unquote, one of them. But that is not how most scholars across time and place read it. Most read into it a morally charged admonition against emulating non-Muslims, especially Christians and Jews. The Prophet in this reading was setting limits on Muslim belonging by defining the line between us and them. In modern times, Muslim thinkers have lashed out at the Muslim ummah, the community, for being copycats in everything from wearing brimmed hats and bow ties to celebrating Valentine's Day and Christmas. Nevertheless, some scholars did read this tradition through a non-polemical lens, preferring to foreground its implications for Muslim group belonging. How do these divergent readings shape the ethical horizon of belonging across Muslim confessional lines? One of the most controversial figures in the history of Islamic scholarship, Taqiyuddin ibn Taymiyyah, who died in 1328 of Damascus, composed an influential reading of this hadith. A geographic and cultural crossroads, medieval Damascus was a cosmopolitan metropolis populated by Christians, Muslims, and Jews. The turn of the 14th century marked a precarious geopolitical moment, as the caliphate had recently fallen for the first time in Islam's history in 1258. And Ibn Taymiyyah was worried that Damascus would be next on the list of Mongol conquests. From Ibn Taymiyyah's perspective, things were on the verge of falling apart. His polemically charged reading of the hadith reflects this broader context. He reads the hadith through a Quranic verse from Surah Al-Ma'idah, Q551, quote, "Whoever among you befriends them becomes one of them." يَتَوَلَّهُمْ. Without further scriptural context, one may not think much about Ibn Taymiyyah's juxtaposition of these two texts. At face value, its structure and content mimics the hadith on imitation, offering another benign observation about group belonging. However, Ibn Taymiyyah's hermeneutical strategy becomes clearer when you read this statement in its fuller textual context. Quote, "O believers, do not take Jews and Christians as friends, as awliya. They are friends of each other. Whoever among you befriends them becomes one of them. God does not guide the wrongdoers." It now becomes apparent that Ibn Taymiyyah wants the reader to see the hadith on imitation through the tinted lens of Muslim interfaith rivalry. In a neutral reading of the hadith on imitation, quote, "to become one of them is not innately good or bad. It depends on the moral status of them." But in Q551, to become one of them is categorically negative, because they are identified as hostile Jews and Christians. By juxtaposing these texts, Ibn Taymiyyah transmits the negative charge of Quran 551 onto the imitation hadith, eliminating its positive valence. Ibn Taymiyyah also adds a new layer to the discourse on belonging by introducing the subject of friendship. The key Arabic term in the Quranic verse, يَتَوَلَّهُمْ, is the act of turning towards someone for friendship, protection, or intimacy, like the related Arabic term awliya. If Jews and Christians are not friends, are they merely acquaintances? Or worse, enemies? This is more than a question about the limits of Muslim belonging. The very notion of politics itself, according to the German political philosopher Carl Schmitt, may be distilled into a basic distinction between friend and enemy. Ibn Taymiyyah's reading politicizes the question of Muslim belonging in the hadith by sharpening the ambiguous distinction between self and other into a clear opposition between friend and enemy. Deepening the connection between the two texts, Ibn Taymiyyah argues that both imitation and friendship are driven by emotion. Like friendship, imitation is an index of admiration and affection. You don't copy someone you don't like or don't look up to. For Ibn Taymiyyah, putting non-Muslims on a pedestal via imitation and friendship becomes a problem, because this dynamic inverts the ideal religio-social hierarchy where, quote, "Islam is above, not below. Islam ya'la wala yu'la." They should be emulating fellow Muslims and lifting up the community of believers. For Ibn Taymiyyah, imitation and friendship across religious lines reflects a defect in Islamic faith, and if intentional, may even lead to apostasy, kufr. He concludes, quote, "Whoever loves an unbeliever is not a true believer," end quote. Ibn Taymiyyah thus endorses an explicit Muslim-first policy with regard to imitation and friendship that defines Muslim belonging sharply. Ibn Taymiyyah is very clear. He wants to burn bridges, not build them. I had to include that. I could not. It is for this reason that his reading is very selective. Ibn Taymiyyah conveniently omits a key Quranic verse, Quran 660-90, that puts a fence, a hermeneutical fence, around Quran 551. Quote, "God only forbids you from turning for friendship and protection to those who fight you in religion, drive you out of your homes, and support others in driving you out." Even if he's unwilling to admit it, a bare reading of this verse is clear. Shunning friendship with Jews and Christians is the exception, not the rule. Let us now draw a comparison to the reading of another Damascene, Najmuddin al-Ghazi, who died in 1651, roughly 3 centuries after Ibn Taymiyyah. A Sufi, jurist, hadith scholar, Quran exegete, biographer, literateur, Najmuddin al-Ghazi belonged to a prominent family of religious scholars in Ottoman-era Damascus and lived a more conventional academic scholarly life than his medieval counterpart. A prolific writer, Ghazi composed approximately 50 works on a wide range of Islamic disciplines. Ghazi composed his commentary on the hadith on imitation in his magisterial treatise on the virtues and vices of imitation. which took him nearly 40 years to complete. Talk about dedication. What emerges from Ghazi's elaborate gloss is a universal theory of human belonging that places love at the center. He writes, quote, "When someone conforms to all the behaviors and moral qualities that define a specific community, he becomes one of them and belongs with them, without any doubt, because his love enables him to acquire all their attributes and mirror all their spiritual states, which then propel him to the highest ranks of love. So how can he not belong with them?" Ghazi shares with Ibn Taymiyyah the keen observation that imitation indexes affection, although he also shares with Ibn Taymiyyah the uncompromising view that Muslims should not cultivate friendship and affection with non-Muslims. He writes, "For all his hostilities there is hope of friendship, except the hostility of one who shuns your religion. Religious difference erects an insurmountable wall between friend and enemy. It is thus not possible for non-Muslims to belong to the community of believers, in his view." So I don't want to portray Ghazi as some kind of liberal, because he's not. He's an orthodox Sunni Sufi jurist, a man of his time. However, Ghazi's reading of the hadith offers us something quite different. He's more interested in the process than the politics of belonging, and specifically centers the role of love. Citing several Sufis, Ghazi observes, quote, that love is conformity. Al-mahabba hiya al-muwafiqa. This is a true statement, he elaborates, because when a human being loves someone, he loves all his habits and virtues. And when he loves all his attributes, he becomes inspired to acquire them and be defined by them. Love is what inspires someone to become like another person and to be associated with him or her, inwardly and outwardly. On the other hand, the opposite vector is equally true. The more a person comes to emulate and resemble another, the deeper the love and affection between them. Imitation and love exist in a dialectical relationship. But what is the origin of this love? Ghazi observes that whether grounded in belief or unbelief, communities are fashioned in the primordial spirit world before coming together on earth. In this cosmology, human and spirit worlds overlap. Drawing on Sufi discourses, Ghazi describes how spirits, arwah, intermingle in the primordial spirit world before being clothed in human form on earth, where they reunite and reactivate their primordial love. True love is divine in origin. After their mortal deaths, these same communities will then be resurrected in the eschaton. Communities that were first formed in the spirit world, then reunited on earth, will once again be reunited in the world to come. An event foretold by the Prophet Muhammad in a hadith, quote, "Whoever loves a people, God will resurrect him in his group." Ghazi shows that a person's community in this world will become his community in the world to come. Love is thus essential for understanding what it means to truly belong to any human community. Without love, one does not truly belong anywhere, according to Ghazi's theory. Imitation in this scenario is merely surface level and not a true indicator of belonging. Love, in fact, is so important that it may even compensate for gross shortcomings in religious practice. To underscore this point, Ghazi cites a well-known prophetic hadith which I re-narrate here. A simple man approached the Prophet Muhammad and asked, quote, "When is the day of judgment?" But instead of answering the question, the Prophet deflects the question back to him, quote, "What have you prepared for it?" The person replies that he is poorly prepared, having failed to perform an abundance of good deeds or acts of worship. Unable to boast of his deeds, he can only recall one virtue that he possesses and proclaims, quote, "Uhibbu Allah wa rasulahu." I love God and his messenger. To this confession, the Prophet famously responds, a person belongs with the one he loves. Al-maru ma'man ahab. And in another narration, Anta ma'man ahbabt. You belong with the one you love. Do not all human beings, even the most devout believers, disobey God on some occasions? Do lapses that are unintentional, resulting from incapacity, weakness, or lack of willpower, carry the same moral value as intentional acts of defiance? Ghazi concludes that spiritual perfection is not a criterion for membership in the community of believers. Even believers whose worship consistently falls short of the prophetic ideal have good cause to be optimistic, a compassionate view that Ghazi expresses in poetic verse. Whoever aspires to reach the farthest station on Resurrection Day, despite his shortcomings in devotion, let him make sincere his love for the Master of creation, the chosen one, for a person belongs with the one he loves. These verses express Ghazi's alacrity to reassure believers of the power of love, to erase sins, and join them with the Prophet in the world to come. By concluding with this punchline, Ghazi reminds the reader that love defines true belonging in Islam. A believer's love for God triumphs over a lifetime of misdeeds. Now to my sort of concluding section and the quasi sort of constructive part. There is copious evidence that cultivating a sense of belonging to the Muslim Ummah, the community, is a normative value within Islam. What is less clear, however, is the value Islamic tradition attributes to cultivating solidarity and belonging with non-Muslims. Nevertheless, I'd like to think that we realize here that cultivating more inclusive styles of religious belonging that display genuine respect and sincere affection for the religious other is a moral imperative in our intertwined world. As believers, we are put on earth to heal and repair, to bring those on the margins to the center. The Prophet, after all, did say, "Blessed are the strangers." Tuba lil ghuraba. But how to go about this is no simple matter, however. And it means that we struggle to read our traditions differently, more closely aligned with the ethical horizons that we aspire to achieve in our ongoing pursuit of the divine. In some cases, we may draw on the pre-modern discursive tradition for inspiration. Take, for example, this case. According to a well-known hadith, the Prophet gave the following counsel. People belong to the religion of their friends, so one should watch whom one befriends. On a plain sense reading, this hadith appears to discourage Muslim friendship with non-Muslims. Ghazi cites this precise tradition as evidence that Muslims should only befriend other upright Muslims. But 1,000 years ago, Andalusian jurist Ibn Abdul Barr offered a different interpretation. Quote, "This means, and Allahu A'lam, God knows best, that people grow habituated to the actions of those they accompany. Ad-deen means habit, al-'ada. So the Prophet commanded that one accompany only those who are seen to do what is lawful and proper, for good is a habit." Here, Ibn Abdul Barr shuns the politics of religious difference and reads the hadith not as a condemnation of befriending non-Muslims, but as advice for forging bonds with those who do good, which may include non-Muslims. This is made possible through his unconventional reading of the Arabic term ad-deen, not as religion, but as habit. This reading is more consistent with the oft-quoted Quran 49:13, which proclaims that sincere devotion to God, taqwa, is a cardinal virtue that sets apart one human from another, not group membership. This reading also is more consistent with our modern social imaginary, which philosopher Charles Taylor has persuasively argued is defined not by the ideal of hierarchy, but by the ideal of equality between citizens. Today, Muslims, especially those living in nation states as minorities among non-Muslims, may draw in Ibn Abdul Barr's reading of this hadith instead of the standard reading in order to feel a stronger sense of belonging at school, at work, and in society. In a similar vein, when reading the Prophet's dictum, "Whoever imitates the people becomes one of them," we may leave Ibn Taymiyyah's medieval polemical reading, which suggests that non-Muslims as a category are unworthy of emulation, in favor of Ghazi's non-polemical reading that centers the discourse of love and pushes the politics of religious difference to the margins. Although, as mentioned above, Ghazi's religious tolerance had its limits, Muslims still possess the hermeneutical tools to reframe the hadith as a call to expand the circle of belonging and build solidarity with religious others. They may come to view the religious other not with contempt, but with respect, reverence, and love. In this way, the hadith becomes an invitation to see beyond confessional lines and be mindful of the divine breath that adheres to all humans. This certainly merits our esteem. As the Quran reminds us, quote, "We have honored the children of Adam. لَقَدْ كَرَمْنَا بَنِي Adam." When we see the shared humanity that connects us to them, the Prophet's statement becomes an exhortation to emulate what is best in others. In fact, because imitation is an index of admiration and affection for others, it may even be read as an exhortation to love thy neighbor. Indeed, when the other looks at us, it confers upon us an ethical responsibility to shun the impulse to dominate and assimilate the other into ourselves. We instead surrender to their irreducible difference. For the true believer whose vision is illuminated by divine radiance, according to a famous hadith, to see the face of the other is to see the face of God. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yusha. Our second speaker is Professor Catherine Cornell from Boston College in Boston.
All right, thank you so much for that presentation, and a lot of what you said about belonging in your introductory remarks are very helpful, and I don't need to go into those kinds of general topics. What I will focus on here today is on what it means to belong to the Christian tradition, and I'm trying to present it in broad terms, and maybe which may sound a little introductory for those of you who are. But I think it might be helpful to sort of look at all the ingredients, you can say, of what goes into Christian belonging. First of all, I think the idea of belonging to a religious tradition has come under a lot of pressure lately. On the one hand, at least in the Christian tradition, there's massive disaffiliation, people leaving the Christian tradition, at least in the Western world. And on the other hand, you have people attaching themselves to their Christian identity in reaction to the insecurities of the modern world and so forth. So religious belonging has become very sort of ambivalent, or an ambivalent category, also because a lot of the violence in the world is associated with religious identity and aggression towards those who don't belong to one's own religious tradition and so on. So the category of belonging is very ambivalent. And I come to the question of religious belonging myself from interest in the question of religious hybridity or multiple religious belonging. So in the West, at least, this has become sort of a very common phenomenon. People who say that they are Christian and Buddhist, or Jew and Buddhist, or Christian and Hindu. So the idea of religious hybridity is very popular, and people just say, you know, I can belong to whatever religion I claim to belong to. It's all about me and my claims and my belief in particular elements of different religious traditions. But I would argue that religious belonging isn't just a matter of me saying what religion I belong to, but that religious traditions also have certain criteria for who belongs and what the boundaries are of religious belonging. And so there's always an objective and a subjective element to religious belonging. And so what I would like to do here is just sketch some elements that go into a Christian understanding of belonging. And what I want to do is show that belonging in Christianity doesn't necessarily have to be exclusive. I'll show how Christian belonging can also be understood in a broad, inclusive sense, while also emphasizing that belonging also is always concrete. You belong to a particular tradition that has particular beliefs and practices that are expected from people that belong to it. So I'll try to sort of navigate that balance between particularity of belonging and openness, or religious identity and inclusiveness beyond the Christian tradition. So first of all, in the Christian tradition, as you all know, the criterion for belonging is baptism. So there's a very clear sort of rite of initiation in the Christian tradition that decides who does and who doesn't belong. So unlike in the Muslim tradition, I think in Christianity there is that clear sacrament that defines who belongs to the Christian tradition. I know that in Judaism you belong to the tradition through birth, and the same is the case for Hinduism. In Christianity you can say the same is the case because you're usually baptized because your parents are Christian, but eventually you have to also confirm that baptism by voluntary commitment to the tradition in the ritual called confirmation. But baptism itself is understood in a very particular way in the Christian tradition as a new birth, as dying to one's old self and being reborn in Christ, as identifying oneself to the death and resurrection of Christ. So it's really a form of rebirth into a particular tradition. I come from the Roman Catholic tradition, and you will see maybe a leaning towards examples from that tradition when I give examples of what is understood by baptism. So the Catechism of the Catholic Church states that baptism, quote, makes the neophyte a new creature, an adopted son of God who has become a partaker of the divine nature, member of Christ and co-heir with him, and a temple of the Holy Spirit. So the Christian understanding of baptism is that we die to our original sin and are reborn in a state of grace. And that state of grace in Christianity is understood also to be a condition for salvation. That doesn't mean that everyone who is baptized is understood to be automatically saved, but at least in Christianity, that is conceived to be a condition for salvation. So, considering those criteria of salvation and of belonging in Christianity, how does Christianity then conceive of the possibility of salvation of non-Christians? So the necessity of baptism was regarded as so serious in the Christian tradition that theologians already in the Middle Ages had to think of how to make sense of all these people who had never heard of Christ and through no fault of their own were unbaptized. So already in the Middle Ages at the Council of Trent, and in fact already before that, Thomas Aquinas was talking of different types of baptism. There's the baptism in re, the actual baptism, and the baptism of desire. So the desire for baptism, even if you weren't exposed to the sacrament, the very desire for that sacrament could count as a sign of being in a state of grace. And even later on, we're talking already about the 19th century, a distinction was made between implicit desire for baptism and explicit desire for baptism. So even if you didn't really desire baptism, but you lead a life of holiness and you live a life according to all the criteria of holiness in the Christian tradition, that shows that you have, in fact, an implicit desire for baptism. And so here you see the way in which Christianity has maintained the necessity of baptism, but still the possibility of salvation for those who were not baptized. So in addition to this, baptism is a permanent represents a permanent ontological change, so it can never be taken away. It's interesting, nowadays, those of you who live in Europe probably know that in countries like Belgium, a lot of people are trying to be unbaptized because of all the scandals in the church. So the idea of unbaptism maybe also in Germany, has become a name that's being circulated. But according to the Catholic or Christian sacramentology, this can never be undone. You can erase your name from the baptismal records, but the effects of baptism are permanent. So you see the importance of baptism for belonging, but then also the way in which Christianity has broadened that understanding of baptism in order not to be exclusive of people who never had the chance of being actually baptized. So there you have sort of the objective criterion of belonging to the Christian tradition. But of course, included in the ritual of baptism is also an explicit desire to live up to the ideals of the tradition, an explicit desire to, in the case of parents, raise one's child according to Christian faith and follow the injunctions of the church. So the ritual of baptism itself asks of the parents or of the initiate, if they are of age, whether they believe in God, whether they believe in the incarnation, in the Trinity, in the church, and in some Christian denominations, in the communion of saints also, and in the resurrection of the dead. So there's a clear content of committing to a tradition and at least aspiring to conform one's own life with the ideals of the tradition. However, every Christian denomination knows that most believers don't always live up to that highest ideal. So there's always a discussion in terms of religious belonging. Well, sometimes people who are non-Christian actually live a life more in conformity to Christian ideals than people who are Christian themselves. And so that's sometimes seen sort of as a basis for saying that belonging to Christianity is meaningless. But of course, you know, what I've said before, the sacrament of baptism marks that distinction, and Christianity just allows for a continuum of conformity of one's life to the ideals of the church. There are certain cases where the church can decide to put people outside of its boundaries, and this is the act of excommunication, but that actually only happens, it doesn't happen, most Christian traditions don't police people's internal faith or practice. But when people actually cause scandal by proclaiming publicly certain heresies, that is when usually the authorities of the church move in and discipline, and in the worst case, excommunicate a person from the church. So again, the ideal is to live up to all of the faith of the church. The expression that is used is obsequium religiosum, and this can be defined as an attempt to overcome any resistance one has to the faith of the tradition. So the attempt to overcome any resistance one has to the faith of the tradition is what people are called to, at least when they proclaim to be Christians. So when the church, though, recognizes, or when Christians recognize that there are people outside of the church that live up to the Christian ideals better than even Christians themselves, there's been all kinds of attempts to make sense of this reality. And the most famous attempt is, of course, Karl Rahner's attempt and his expression of anonymous Christian. And I will read you, because this expression has been, you know, used at length and bantered around, but I'll read you what he says exactly in his third of four thesis. He says, he refers to those who have already accepted the grace of God, quote, as the ultimate unfathomable entelechy of his existence, by accepting the immeasurableness of his dying existence as opening out into infinity. So people who recognize, you can say, the existence of God and open their life to the presence of God in their life can be seen as anonymous Christians in this very broad understanding of anonymous Christianity. So the expression may be sort of a little bit problematic, because people have seen it as sort of an expression of superiority or arrogance on the part of Christianity. On the other hand, Rahner never meant it as an expression to be used, or as an accusation or an expression to be used for non-Christians themselves. It's a way of Christian openness, or opening up Christianity to the possibility of recognizing the salvific status of people outside of the church. And he said explicitly, when he was accused sort of this arrogance, he said it's actually the source of greatest humility for both herself and for the church, for it is a profound admission of the fact that God is greater than man and the church. So what he emphasizes is that as Christians, what we know is that there is salvation in the church, but God is always greater than the church and then our understanding of God's self. And so we cannot limit the possibility of salvation to Christians. In fact, I want to read you something that the Catechism also says of baptism itself, because it's a very interesting qualification. It says, the Church does not know of any means other than baptism that assures entry into eternal beatitude. It says God has bound salvation to the sacrament of baptism, but he himself is not bound by his sacraments. And I find the expression or the words, the church does not know of any means other than baptism. So implicit, you can say, there may be other means outside of the church, but this is what we know from within the church. So I think this can also be seen as sort of an expression of humility in Christianity, recognizing that this is all we know, and that's the same. And the same goes for Rahner's expression of anonymous Christian. All salvation, from a Christian perspective, comes through Christ, and this is all we know. So this is how we affirm the possibility of salvation outside the church. Third, belonging as baptism, belonging as assent to particular teachings. Thirdly, belonging as becoming part of a religious community. And we've heard already a lot about the importance of community for religious wholeness and happiness and so forth. In the Christian tradition, as in most other religious traditions, the church has provided important sacraments or important rituals to celebrate the turning moments in people's lives. It's provided, support in times of difficulty, and just plain conviviality for people to form religious communities. It's also the case, as we know, that churches and mosques, all religious organized, nothing has been as effective in helping out in times of crisis as religious organizations, because they can mobilize their members for a common purpose beyond themselves. And so the church has been very active in founding schools and hospitals and orphanages and so on. So a very important dimension of belonging is participating in a community that pursues something beyond oneself. It also, as we know, is a matter of creating religious identity. Now, there are a lot of things that go into religious identity, but nothing is as powerful as religious faith or religious beliefs in shaping people's personal identity. And this, of course, is what makes religion abused or allows religions to be used and abused also for all kinds of nationalistic and ideological purposes. So that's one of the problems of one's religious identity being so sharply defined by religion. On the other hand, of course, whatever can be used for evil can also be used for the highest good. And what we see nowadays also is that even though religions have been, part or, used in religious violence and religious wars, nowadays what we see is that leaders of various Christian and Muslim traditions are playing a very important role in peace building between religions. And when I think of just the most recent popes of the Catholic Church, John Paul XXIII, his document Pacem in Terris, Paul VI founded World Youth Day for Peace. John Paul II started the Assisi meetings between religious traditions, the peace meetings in Assisi. And then, of course, Pope Francis has been absolutely committed to dialoguing with Islam and with other religious traditions, I think mostly for the purpose of peace building. So religions, in that sense, being part of these kinds of communities has a very important instrumental role in peace building. Another element of belonging is inscribing oneself in what I call a chain of tradition. When we think of religious traditions, or the way religious traditions or tradition itself, the word tradition, is often seen as something ancient, something that continues through time, but is just out to replicate itself and to conform its own, or to bring people into its own conservative sort of ideals and mindsets. But tradition is always a matter of bringing what is handed down from the past and bringing it into the future. And so belonging to a tradition is also a matter of not having to reinvent the wheel constantly, of being able to enjoy and profit from the wisdom of the past. Traditions are, I describe traditions as sort of transmissions of experience from generation to generation, and religious insights that have been developed and purified and handed down from one tradition to the next. And so belonging to the tradition is being a recipient of all of this wisdom of the past. That is one, I think, very important aspect of belonging to a particular tradition. But it's also a matter of continuing the tradition and handing it down to the future. And that's where my worry about multiple religious belonging and religious hybridity comes in, because people who are hybrids don't tend to put much energy into committing to a particular religious tradition. But a tradition only continues if it's also renewed. Traditions only continue if they're able to answer to new questions that arise, a new context in which we live. And so in the Christian tradition, the main challenge of the new context in which we live is, of course, the context of religious pluralism and religious diversity. And how do Christians contribute their insights and their effort to rethinking the tradition and opening it up to including other religious traditions also, or respecting other religious traditions? And that's where the field that I'm involved with, comparative theology, I think makes an important contribution, because comparative theologians ideally are grounded in a very particular tradition and engage in constructive dialogue with other religions to see what they can learn from these other religious traditions, so as to broaden and deepen and enhance the tradition and move it forward. So this is one way of engaging new questions, or the new reality of religious plurality, that is, I think, very promising going forward. It's one of the theological ways of doing this. But theologians have also tried to make sense of religious pluralism and the understanding of Christianity in very creative ways. And I'll just quote from one famous Dominican theologian, Claude Geoffroy, is a French Dominican who was very engaged in questions of religious plurality. And I asked him to contribute to a volume of religious hybridity years ago, and this is what he wrote about how to understand Christian identity. He says it involves a way of being and an act of faith, hope, and love that can be combined with any number of secular and religious orientations. He states that there is, quote, a Christian way of being a man or a woman, a Christian way of loving, of working, of suffering, or of rejoicing. There's a Christian way of being European, African, Asian. And then he asks, must one go as far as to say paradoxically that there's a Christian way of being a Hindu, a Buddhist, or a Confucian? In any event, Christianity is the religion of the gospel. That is to say, if it defines itself more by the spirit than the letter, then it should not be compared or contrasted to any other religions. This is a very interesting quote that we can comment on for a while, I think, but you see how theologians are trying to open up the understanding of Christianity. You can say, this implies, again, maybe some form of Christian exceptionalism, but it just is one way of opening up the tradition. Other Christians also who have engaged in particular with Islam, like the Italian Syrian Jesuit Paolo Dall'Olio, he confessed, quote, I desire to be part of Islam, to dedicate myself to loving it, and first of all to loving Muhammad. May God's blessing be upon him and his ummah. This dual belonging to Islam and Christianity is always based and originally centered on Christ and his church. So he wants to belong to Islam, and that desire to belong is based on his faith in Christ and his church. So for him, quote, becoming a Christian is not so much about belonging to a community that establishes prohibitions, dietary or others, as it is about integrating a community in motion driven by the charity of Christ to meet everyone. And I'll quote one other Christian theologian who, in that sense, thinks of belonging not to necessarily a sociological community, but belonging ultimately to Christ and to God. Christian belonging, Werner Jean says, is always dynamic. It is open to God's transformative action. This eschatological nature of Christian faith frees Christians from forms of narrow definition of identity and forms of cozy or neurotic belonging to their tradition. They do not need to be afraid to meet their own otherness or the otherness of others, for their ultimate project is not to stabilize their own selves, but to belong to God and one another in Christ, and prepare themselves for God's transformative actions in all of their lives as well as in the entire universe. So here you see ultimately his statement is that we ultimately belong to God and to one another in Christ. That is his expression, and that's also the title of my paper. I just have one more point I want to make about belonging that is often overlooked, and that has to do with the spiritual dimension of belonging. So we usually see belonging in terms of assent and doctrine and so forth, but religious belonging to Christianity or to any other religious tradition is ultimately to surrender to a truth not of one's own making. And for me, that's sort of the greatest argument against religious hybridity, where individuals combine elements from different religious traditions on the basis of their own desire and orientation. But religion is about surrender of one's own will and desire. Every religious tradition, as we've heard before, regards selfishness, self-centeredness as the cause of all evil. And one way of overcoming one's self-centeredness is to surrender one's own desire and one's own will to greater truth. And I think the structure of that surrender can be seen most clearly in monastic tradition or in religious orders, where individuals who enter monastic traditions or religious orders completely submit their own desire and their own will to the orientation or to the commands of a superior or to a rule that they follow in daily life, so as not to be preoccupied with their own desire and their own will. And that, I think, is what religion is ultimately about. You know, I really like Nicholas's Lash's definition of religion as a form, schools that lead to the purification of desire and the weaning of idolatry, is his definition of religion. And I think that's a very powerful and important way of thinking about religious belonging also, that it's only in surrendering to a particular path, not to religion in general, but to a particular path that one is able to really overcome that self-centeredness. So by way of conclusion, from the very beginning, belonging to Christianity was likened to belonging to a new family with a particular ethos, ways of being and behaving, memories, and orientation to the future. Baptism was regarded as a new birth into this family, where Christian belonging is most beautifully described in the Acts of the Apostles. Quote, "All who believed were together and held all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. Day by day, as they spent much time together in the temple, they broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having the goodwill of all the people. And day by day, the Lord added to their number those who were being saved." I think I'll just add in this beautiful quote. Thank you.
Thank you both for very rich presentations and some complex ideas there and some interesting juxtapositions, I think. Can I perhaps begin by putting a question to both of you? Samuel Huntington of The Clash of Civilizations fame defined a civilization as the largest we to which I feel I belong. The largest we, W-E, we, to which I feel I belong. And I think that's a pretty good definition. And strangely, it's the clash of civilizations went in quite the other direction, because when we think of all the we's, all the first-person plurals that we belong to, it includes our family, our nationality, our religion, all that, our identity as a first person is an identity in the plural. So I'm just wondering, could we actually borrow the unfortunate Huntington's definition to look at this question of belonging to a religious tradition, and the idea that, to underline what you finished with, Catherine, this sense of entering into a new, larger we, and whether or not, in fact, the largest we feel we belong to is infinitely expandable, and that is the task for us as believers, in a sense, to expand the first-person plural to which we assent, and not just to which we assent, but to which we believe God is at work creating, a single humanity, as in the beginning.
Yeah, I think that's a lovely way of putting it. One thing I didn't mention, but that I think we have to also reckon with, and that's also what was part of Huntington's thesis, that there's always an element of opposition in every we that we belong to. And I think every religion has to reckon with it, and that's sort of what you were also bringing up, and what I was also trying to negotiate, because identities are by nature oppositional. The we I belong to is formed partly in opposition to the other we's. And so with every religious tradition, this is how they all emerged, in reaction to one another, or as a correction, as you put it, to the other. But it still is by nature oppositional. And I think that's what has to be dealt with always, in terms of how do we come to terms with that and still allow for a broader understanding of this we that is more inclusive. But I don't think we can jump there before we have come to terms with the problems of the more limited we. And that's sort of why I was trying to talk about belonging to something particular is important, and that particularity is by nature exclusive. Religions are not seamlessly reconcilable with one another. There are always points where we disagree, and one or the other is true. And so that's what we always have to somehow come to terms with, I think. So it's a beautiful way of putting it, but I think it also has to come to terms with that element.
Yeah, I perhaps want to add that not every distinction is oppositional.
No, but some are.
Some are, yeah.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think I'd want to ground the we in a context, more of a specific context, and so when thinking about this expansion of the we, I feel, and in some ways, when reading certain texts and feeling uncomfortable because the we is defined so narrowly, I also understand that impulse feel a sense of coziness and home within a particular tradition or within a particular stream of thought. At the same time, I understand the ethical sort of obligations and ethical expectations given our interconnected world, given the sort of the great vastness of difference that we inhabit, to at the same time expand our notion of what we can be. I didn't intend to rhyme that, by the way. That kind of just came. And so when I'm thinking about this expansion of the we, I'm thinking about sort of these social interactions, these feelings of connection that I think are so vital to human flourishing and so vital to spiritual and emotional and even physical health. I'm thinking a bit less because I don't view myself as a theologian per se. I don't carry that expertise in the sense of what at least I perceive theology to be. So I, at least in my own work, tend to focus on a more kind of interactive realm. If that makes sense.
Perhaps I can throw it open to the house. Do we have a roving mic, Sam? Oh, yes, we do. If you were hiding behind the flowers, I can't see you. So or maybe it's me who's hiding behind the flowers.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I had a question for both of you about, I guess, what could be called historicism as like an interpretive strategy. So, Dr. Patel, like do theologians use historicism as a strategy to deal with narrations like this one? I assume they must, right? And the same might go for baptismal practices. Do modern theologians, you describe the problem of baptism as the marker of belonging, and then coming up against the problem of, there are all these people, a mass of people that are not baptized. So do people, or do theologians also, is that the fallback theological strategy for dealing with that kind of a problem, to say, well, this was a practice of a certain place and time and it's no longer applicable for these kinds of reasons?
I think that historicism, in terms of, if I understand you correctly, sort of putting a fence around a text, if that makes sense, or a moment to give it specificity, is definitely a strategy that can be used and people continue to use in pre-modern Islamic tradition and certainly modern Islamic tradition. It isn't always successful, and one has to make a case for example, arguing that a tradition like this should be read in a different way. But I think that's where the expertise of the person doing the interpreting, the level of detail that they go into, could be persuasive. It might be persuasive, or it may not be persuasive. But I think it can be used as a strategy to, as it were, put certain texts in a particular place in order to think beyond those particular texts, or to imagine or reimagine what a tradition or practice or an idea may look like in new moments. So it's something that you can find resistance against it among folks that think that it's irresponsibly used or done poorly, and that is also certainly possible. And I don't always agree with attempts to historicize certain texts or practices if the case doesn't appear to be strong enough, depending on the situation. But I think for those who want to, especially in the case of interfaith relations, and are dissatisfied with what they encounter in tradition broadly understood, it's certainly one strategy among many, and I think there are others. There's linguistic strategies as well, like this word means that, or this word as was used by that 10th century theologian or 10th century jurist that I had mentioned, Ibn Abd al-Barr, to advance an argument that wasn't rejected, even though it wasn't a mainstream interpretation.
I think in the Christian tradition there's a little more ease with historicizing, and as a result of the encounter with other religions, sort of expressions like extra ecclesiam nulla salus has been looked at in great detail, like what was the context in which that expression was first advanced in the 3rd, 4th century in reaction to certain prosecutions where people were apostatizing from the faith and so on. So there's a whole context in which that expression that was very exclusive to the church is now being reconsidered sort of in its historical context. And so there's a lot of historicizing, I think, that is happening in the Christian tradition, and a lot of attempt to recover sources that are more open and more inclusive. And as I was saying, sort of the very idea of baptism of desire. I don't think the idea of baptism as necessary for Christian belonging is something that will ever be questioned or changed. So that I think is sort of a firm aspect of the tradition. But how that's seen as necessary for salvation or whether there's universal salvation, these are all things that are being questioned.
So thank you very much for both talks. I got very interested when you, Professor Connie, spoke about heretics and how communities, especially Christian communities, deal with heretics. In the past weeks, we had very strong discussions in Austria about neo-integralists, and we discovered that some of the US neo-integralists have strong ties to Austria. And I read some of their papers and handbooks, and these Catholics demand to discover heretics, to give them, hand them over to the states and punish them, even with the sword. And I'm wondering, is this a serious movement that we have to take seriously as Catholics, or is it some strange people, small groups, or I don't know? Yeah.
I don't think I've heard of that group. I don't think they have to be taken seriously, but I do think that brings up sort of the question of how people latch on to their religious identities in context of anxiety and fear, and in the context of religious pluralism, that people double down on their religious identity and hold on to it in this kind of anxious way that's also, the opposite reaction to religious pluralism. So that's what fundamentalism or integralism is about, I think, and that has to be also, I think, confronted. There's also a whole discussion about who has the power to decide who is a heretic and who isn't. This is also a very big question, of course, in the course of the tradition. And what's interesting, actually, is how dialogue with other religions is leading to sort of a reconsideration of traditions that were historically regarded as heretical, and looking more at what were the political and power elements involved in that, and were they maybe more legitimate than they were said to be, and can we recover these elements in our own tradition instead of excluding them? So these are all sort of part of more open understanding of dialogue and how they can lead to a reconsidering of traditional heresies. But that movement sounds scary, but I've never heard of it, so.
Yes, yeah. Wait, just wait for the mic, please.
And so, actually, why did you mention Ibn Taymiyyah as the main topic in presenting the Islam among him? Even Ibn Taymiyyah is actually considered by the most of Islamic community as Khawarij. That means he's not really representing the real Islam. And also, why I have observed always there's some relation between the Anglo-Saxon community and Ibn Taymiyyah. So they are somehow related to each other. So maybe you can, in historical context also, why you can get this impression about?
Sure. As I mentioned before, he's a controversial figure. But from my vantage point, he still remains a pretty influential figure among many Muslim communities, whether or not one identifies with them or not. So, I mean, one could debate whether he fits into the fold of Islam or not, and I'm not here to, apostatize anyone or not. That's not what I do. But it so happens that in this particular discourse and this particular hadith, his interpretation is among the most influential. So, from his contemporaries such as Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, to even others not within the Hanbali madhab or those who identify with that particular madhab, to reformers like Muhammad Abdu, for example, and others as well, draw upon him. So, of course, as Muslims, or those who identify as Muslims, are entitled to disregard, right, particular individuals or particular scholars, and that's the decision and the kind of the individual believer. But within this discourse on belonging, within the kind of longer intellectual history of the discourse on this particular hadith, he authored the most influential pre-modern treatise on this subject, in terms of its impact on modern Muslims and modern Islam. So it's important to engage him, and also, from my kind of what I'm trying to do, also draw contrasts, right, between what some other folks are doing, like Najmuddin al-Ghazi, but also show that they were aligned. They were aligned in certain ways as well in terms of their views on friendship between non-Muslims. So, yeah, I mean, I could go on, but that's a brief response.
Yes, Asim. Martin, you go, and then Asim after you.
Thank you both for your presentations. The heresy question got me thinking in a different direction of maybe how we can think of religious difference, as well as the Huntington greatest we can imagine. And so this is kind of clearly a question of formation, but thinking about, I want to kind of raise two issues on both sides of a spectrum, right? Because in both talks, we're focusing on a specific kind of difference, religious difference, Christian tradition, Muslim tradition, and how can we talk to the non-Christian or non-Muslim other with respect to belonging. But the heresy question raised for me, well, so much of the building bridges experience is witnessing intra-tradition tension as Muslims watching Christians debate and Christians watching Muslims debate. I'm wondering what we could learn from that turmoil, right? About, what do we think of the Church of Latter-day Saints? What do we think of the Nation of Islam or Ahmadis, right? That there's these groups that seem to get marginalized and cast out. What could that contribute to this discussion of belonging when it comes to the larger Christian and Muslim tradition? But then on the opposite end of the spectrum, it makes me think, well, when you pose, well, what's the greatest we that we belong to? Well, you could actually say humanity, humankind. But yet we want to dwell and fixate on our religious identity in that tradition, or even beyond humanity, right? That maybe identify with creation, beneath the Creator. So at least in my mind, I see this as kind of two ends. Just throwing that out there, what do you see as maybe benefits or drawbacks from swinging from one polarity to the other?
Would you like to take this question?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point you're making, and that's certainly an experience I had also in my first Building Bridges seminar, that the differences within religions are really what I come away with, more than even between religions. So, I mean, I haven't really dwelled on the differences within religious traditions, but belonging is ultimately belonging to a particular denomination or to a particular church with very particular interpretation of the tradition that regards other interpretation also as other. So belonging, you can say there's a big we, but then it becomes smaller and smaller, and by necessity so, because particular or faith traditions are particular forms of practice where you do it like this and not like that. So I think practice, if you look at practice besides faith, or at ritual besides faith, there's something very particular and very small in terms of our belonging that goes into our religious identities. But there is still, beyond all our differences, we are all followers of one particular person, Christ, in the Christian tradition. So, and I think that's the largest we that you can conceive of within the Christian tradition, is our common focus on this particular person and the fact of discipleship. It's also something that I wasn't able to mention, but it's a matter of discipleship of Christ, and that's what our identity is as Christian. So it points to all these differences, but it also points to one common element within our tradition as Christian. And I'm sure that the same is true for Islam and its internal differences of interpretation of the tradition and how to practice and so on, that all makes for differences within the tradition, as is in any religious tradition. But ultimately, you are all followers of a particular person also. Am I right?
I would, it's a great question. And I think on multiple levels, we see interaction between intra-religious difference and inter-religious difference. And that's something that certainly has come through in my own work in different ways. So, for example, in the case of different Muslim views, say Ibn Abdul Barr and Ibn Taymiyyah on friendship, for example, so how their internal differences reflect different views of the religious other. And then at the level of identity, I mentioned the example that it's helpful sometimes, or often, to think about interreligious difference or or identity between different religions in broader contexts of things like gender, ethno-racial difference, because they often interact in different ways. And even when Muslims talk about something like a beard, and you look at Muslim discourses on, say, grooming a beard, an article which I'm writing right now, which is fun, they talk about everything from conceptions of beauty to masculinity to distinction between religious communities. All of these meanings are entangled, metaphorically, in the beard. And so, when you look at these markers of difference, it is often the case that these various styles of difference or types of difference kind of interact, overlap, with one another. So I definitely think, heuristically speaking and analytically speaking, it's important to keep an eye on that inter-religious difference, even when talking about intra-religious difference, when talking about interreligious difference. That makes sense. So thank you.
It's something that has come up a lot sort of in discussions of interreligious dialogue, that there are levels at which we can bridge traditions that constitute our identity, our gender, our race, our social class, our intellectual formation, and so on. That as a Christian, I am constituted also by all these other elements that may form bridges to people from other religious traditions that have those same characteristics. And that's, only partly convincing, I find, because ultimately I think you cannot put religious difference on the same level as gender difference, class difference, race difference, and so on, which happens a lot today, in fact. I think all those categories are becoming very confused in the literature on religious pluralism, and that religious difference has a very unique and distinctive place in all these distinctive categories, and has to be dealt with in its own particular way. It's a big discussion, but I just wanted to raise that.
Awesome.
Well, thank you. Am I on?
Yes.
Well, I have lots of questions and comments, but obviously I have to be
we've got a whole week to
Yes,
discuss them.
For both of you, but if I may just go back to Ibn Taymiyyah and the quote that Professor Patel used with reference to Ibn Taymiyyah saying, "Whoever loves an unbeliever is not a believer." It just occurred to me, as we all know, Muslim jurists traditionally take the view that a Muslim may marry a Christian or Jewish lady. So that, following from that, it would seem that he would take the view, Ibn Taymiyyah, that a Muslim husband should not love his wife, which seems to be strange. I just also wanted to ask Professor Patel, you mentioned towards the end of your presentation social interactions as ways of expanding the we. Perhaps if you would like to maybe expand on that and to say what you mean specifically, what kinds of social interactions could serve the purpose of expanding the we.
Great, thank you. Ibn Taymiyyah lived a monastic life. He never married. And he's a bachelor. And so I don't know if that impacted or shaped his views on interfaith marriage. But my sense would be he would accept the kind of normative mainstream Islamic view that it's okay for a Muslim man to marry a Christian or Jewish woman. And I don't think he would object, if I'm imagining what he might say, to fostering love between them. He has a very kind of specific concern, and that is Muslim interfaith relations. And so that also means that there are some blind spots, such as the one that you brought up. But it's funny because in modern discourses on this subject of friendship and love, that precise example often comes up. Like, hey, this romantic love is permitted, so why the difficulty with among some religious elites with friendship between Muslims and non-Muslims if this is explicitly granted permission in God's holy book? With regard to your other question about social interaction, and I think I was sort of gesturing towards that with my concluding part, thinking about what might belonging look like between religious communities, or what might friendship look like between religious communities. And I think there are so many realms. I would say just here is an example, right? That we're here interacting across religious lines, building friendships, building connections, learning from one another. Yet no one's, necessarily requesting the other to convert, for example, and say no one's pushing their religious agenda upon the outsider per se. Yet we're interacting, we're sharing ideas, we're learning from one another, and inevitably our discourses become inflected with, I think uncontrollably, by the vocabularies, the concepts, the ideas, even the feelings that emerge from our encounter with religious others. And in my own scholarship, it's undeniable. It's undeniable.
As the clock moves closer to 6, if there are any questions from those who are not members of the seminar, you have your chance now, or well, not forever, hold your peace, but at least until the next seminar. Okay, well, thank you to Catherine and to Yusha. You've got us thinking, and we've got plenty of time now to explore these questions that you've opened up for us. And what has also been opened up for us is a reception at the back there, thanks to Leila and the ZIT. So thank you all for coming. For those of you who are tuning in.